name is Lisa Schweitzer. I am a professor here in the Saul Price School of Public Policy, Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis, DUPSA. That's quite a mouthful. And there are regular seminar series we moved to Friday in order to accommodate our two guests from out of town. This is the Urban Growth Seminar. We try to have at least one of these every single month. Next month we'll be featuring Dowell Myers, who's sitting here. And today we have to hand out some thanks before we get to our main events here. Thank you so much to Angela. I think she might have escaped already, but she handles all the lovely food that you guys are enjoying. We also need to thank the department who provided some of the funding for the event and an anonymous donor. So thank you, anonymous donor and department and Dean and Rob. With no further ado, I've seen bits of This is a Black Spatial Imaginary, and I just think it's really brilliant. And it's important, particularly for planning students and for policy students, simply because we see space represented using a white spatial imaginary all the time, right? The idea of an imaginary, the idea of representation and vision, right, projected across space is something that's highly culturally contingent. And it is an expression of power and control as much as it is a way of measuring or a way of articulating the built environment. And so our two guests today have done some really interesting work doing that from a perspective that opens things up a little bit more. Professor Lisa Bates is at Portland State University in a department that is too long for me to remember, right? Well, it's the Toulon School. Yes, the Toulon. And the department is?
It's TSOS.
TSOS. And you guys have a straight urban planning department, or is the urban studies and urban planning? Lisa's work on housing and critical perspectives on race and planning, I think, is probably one of the most important voices in our generation of scholars. She and I are contemporaries. She has taught me a great deal over time about these issues, and from what I can tell with all of her students, she's a great teacher and well beloved at PSU. This is my first chance to actually meet Professor Sharita Town. Sharita, you are a professor at?
Pacific Northwest College of Art.
And you are a practicing artist. All right, and with no further ado, guys, could you please welcome our two guests? You have an hour, and then we just take questions.
So thanks for having us here. We're gonna be talking about some work and showing you some of the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years, really bringing theories from Black geographies into our respective and intersecting fields of practice in urban planning and in art practice in Portland, Oregon, where we live. We'll tell you a little bit about Portland, but what we're gonna be talking about is a series of our interdisciplinary collaborations to try to elicit stories around Blackness and place and space, to try to create new forms of practice. This is a Black Spatial Imaginary was the title of this set of projects. It was a series of art installations and also public space interventions that are about the movement and fixity of the Black community. In a moment in Portland of really intense gentrification, and really an erasure of many of the physical locations where the Black community has lived in Portland. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Portland People's Plan, which is an emancipatory planning process that used sort of generative thinking and art and creative tools to ask Black Portlanders to imagine a city that loves Black people. So our work and the starting point was really trying to reject the white box of the gallery and the white box of the page of the planning document, and to ground the work in a different kind of geographic imaginary, a Black spatial imaginary, in both analytic and poetic ways. And this is one of the prints that Sharita created for a gallery show, which speaks to present, past, but also into the future, using sort of layering techniques and images, and you'll be able to see a number of her images throughout the show. We were very much guided in our thinking when we talk about Black geographies by the work of Clyde Woods, the late Clyde Woods. Some of you may know him because he was grounded here in Southern California. And his exhortation to us as social scientists in particular, geographers in particular, and planners, but really all of us who sort of look at Black life, to ask whether the kinds of tools that we're using to measure and speak about Black communities are more suited to describing social death than they are to describing life. And so often in our work together in sort of our kind of question and praxis space was, how can we make sure that we're using the surgeon's tools? How can we not just, sort of look at the dead bodies on the slab, but actually use the tools that we have from planning and art to consider whether we need to, amend the death certificate, if you will, to re-diagnose the conditions, and to bring these archival materials and histories into conversation with live presence of actual Black people in actual places right now, not just as sort of objects in a museum. And sort of this defiance of erasure, and I think we hear a lot in Black Portland, we still hear. It's a phrase that you hear a lot in talking to people in the community and working with them on planning and research interviews. We still hear a real defiance to say that you might think that we're not present anymore, but we are. And so we really wanted to try to use this art and planning work to move forward collective thinking that brings us actually into a conversation as it unfolds into actually the spatialization of reparations, that we could talk about this particular place, its particular history, and begin to realize that that's really what we're talking about. We're really talking about spatialized reparations.
So this is an example of one of the prints that we do. So just an example of how we turn ideas and research into form. So this is a cyanotype that we kind of think of as a shadow memorial. So in digging through the archives, we found the demolition lists of the over 100 structures that were demolished for the Memorial Coliseum. And so this actually is a cyanotype underneath, and on top of it there's a clear piece of mylar where all of those addresses, which you can see in that close-up there, were printed, right? So they're kind of sitting on top of this print. And so the top one, Jumptown, that's what they used to call this area around Memorial Coliseum before it was there. There's the original print, Jumptown, on the cyanotype of the actual lived life there, of who actually, breathed life into this place. It looked often like this, like people dressed up and going to a jazz club. But then also in revisiting it, kind of creating this gold plaque on top of it, right? So yeah, and we actually put that directly, in a lot of our prints, the direct quotes from Clyde Woods or Catherine McCritchick directly into the cyanotype. So this is just one of the ways that we turn that research into form in art.
So, and this is part of the gallery exhibition where we tried to bring people into a greater awareness of what Clyde Woods called regionally specific traps. So what are the kind of specific racial and poverty traps that exist in a particular place? He wrote a lot about the Gulf Coast in Mississippi, and we're trying to uncover and unpack what is it in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon, and in Portland specifically that's happening around white supremacy and capitalism and the way that it's sort of sticking people into these traps, right? So yes, linked to a general history of urban planning and the use of the biological metaphor to talk about things like neighborhood triage, the spread of sort of cancer of blight, the invasion succession of neighborhoods that were used to justify these demolitions, like that list of addresses that you just saw, and bringing forward this archival work that relates to redlining, to serial displacement, and the way that planning logics were used to remove and disperse people. So if you're not as familiar with Portland, just keeping in mind, Portland is the whitest big city in America. Historically has never been more than about 7% Black, and has over time maintained very stringent enclosures with over 95% of the Black folks living in the Portland region living in a very small slice of the city. And that really represents almost all the Black people in the state of Oregon, in the Albina district, where there have been no fewer than 4 major urban renewal blight clearance projects. And so serial displacement within families in the Black community is intergenerational. There's virtually no Black person who's been in Portland for more than just themselves, like 0 generations, who has not experienced a state-led displacement of their homes. Here we're going to show a video created by Dustin Tolman, another Black videographer that we work with. And you want to say about the trajectory?
Yeah, so the idea was in that gallery setting, you saw those prints, and then you also saw that desk in the front that had these manila envelopes where we literally provided all of our research. So people could sit there and just dig through all of the same files that we did. But at the end, you saw a monitor. And so this is that video that we collaborated with Dustin on. And so it's the drone footage from Northwest Portland near Union Station, crossing Broadway Bridge and over into Northeast Portland, past Memorial Coliseum, past the hospital. And so it really just follows the trajectory of Black people through Portland. And what we've done is we've paired that footage with oral histories and testimonies at different city councils and things, so that it's almost like the voices kind of rise up from the land. So we'll just play that for you.
So we've really tried to pull in our archival work in a way that would do something which Annie Ko from the University of Hawaii refers to as making the present strange, that to sort of reboot our narrative to understand that it wasn't necessarily going to be like it is today, and that people were raising their voices in very specific ways all along history to say, actually, no, we don't want this at all. And we've also, can you go back? Yeah. Back one. Been trying to bring these practices into our work with the Portland African American Leadership Forum, who you saw there speaking about one of the sites of expropriation, to try to move into these justice-oriented planning actions that we could talk about going into the future. Okay, so, and you can find this online. You can see the whole document of the People's Plan. It's a Black-led planning process that activated the idea of Black geographies as where people are. So it does speak to the history in Northeast Portland, but we actually began the planning process in community engagement, actually mostly where Black folks have been displaced to, which is the outer east part of Portland. There's not as much work to think about, like, how do you plan with people once they've been displaced? How do you both realize a connection to a historical place, but also the desire to make place where you are? And thinking about expanding our notions of the rights of the city to talk about the right to be in and to be seen in place and to make and shape the places where we live. So not only talking about historical neighborhoods as place to make claims, but in all the neighborhoods where Black people are. So we hosted some generative conversations, and this woman here with the white sweater on, Joy Davis, is the director of PULF and was sort of managed this entire process. And you see the spaces very activated with art, and we're actually in a gallery in St. John's, which is well up into North Portland and the peninsula. It's a place where a lot of Black folks live now, and had what's called a kaleidoscope conversation, which is basically a conversation constructed by questions. So could we use questions to start to loosen up our minds a little bit and see if we can get out of the kind of constant gravity of a white spatial imaginary?
Yeah, and the way that a kaleidoscope is set up is it's set up around a tension, and the tension is defined as the gap between the current reality and a possible future. And so with this particular group of people, like, we're asking questions and answering with questions, but the overall goal is to get to where we want to be, right? So that Black people can reclaim space, think about all the steps that we have to get through there. So here's some of the questions that were generated as we kind of went through the evening. Why is it that a lot of urban planning, not just in Portland, but throughout the country, is based in putting a freeway through a Black neighborhood? How do we support existing spaces? Are there existing spaces? How do we catalog future and existing spaces? How do we share information about the lack of spaces and future spaces once they're established? Why don't we take ownership of gentrified spaces? How can we reappropriate spaces? How much anger do we have to swallow to think we deserve these spaces? And how much permission do we need to have to create these spaces for ourselves?
So it's a kind of conversation that can really open up from a set of like pretty practical questions to a much bigger notion of like, how can we be ourselves in space? And this was sort of the guiding generative question of the People's Plan. What would it be like if you felt like your city loved Black people? And one of the participants in one of the roundtables was asking, what if when I dream big, people would come at me with everything they've got? And how could we create that as a vision and a platform specifically for Black people in Portland? We also, so this is an advocacy planning document that is now fully realized and is being used to advocate for very specific policies and practices, but also for a broader racial justice lens in the city of Portland's work. And one of the projects that we did during that time was a postcard. People could fill out postcards at an event, Dear Next Mayor. It was during the mayoral election to say, like, what do you care about and what does Portland's Black future need you to do? And we had these for Black Portlanders and for allies, both, to present then to our new mayor, who is doing some things, which I'll mention in a little bit. He's doing some stuff, but maybe not all the things.
So yeah, the People's Plan, the year before we did the Black Spatial Imaginary really set us up with this line of inquiries, and a lot of the questions that we asked, we ended up putting in self-published zines and things and distributing them throughout the art show. So really carrying forward that research. This particular image right here, we were thinking about like enacting those questions in reclaiming gentrified space, but actually also asking what does it look like to use the surgeon's tools in public art projects, so out in the public realm, and how those actions, how these interventions in public space can point us to a spatialization of reparations. So this is just one example, right? So that first gallery that you saw, imagine like it's right here on the map. And so you move out of that gallery, you cross the Broadway Bridge, and then right on the east side of the Broadway Bridge, you run into this boulder. And this boulder, it's a monument for this guy named George Washington Shaver that nobody cares about. And the plaque says like, George Washington Shaver traveled his house by steamboat up the river, and his wife Elizabeth, they lived here. Steamboats. And that's all it says. And nobody ever notices it in public space. But they put the boulder as a memorial there the same time that they raised the Black neighborhood, right? So they didn't publicly, like, they didn't put a monument of like, sorry, we took your house, sorry, Jumptown is over, but like, here's a boulder about George Washington Shaver. Sorry, I don't mean it. It's just very frustrating. Anyway, so what we did was we created a counter plaque. So we used the same language from the plaque and we put it in a light box. And so we put the light box as a new plaque in the shadow of the boulder and projected on the back of the boulder, this is a Black Spatial Imaginary. And so we just wanted to kind of reclaim that space. So what does it look like to memorialize differently? Is one of the things that we were thinking through.
And we also use that space, this is right by the boulder, we use that space to project the living voices of Black people who are speaking to the past, but are also present now and are speaking to that presence. So this is one of the kind of oral history interviews that we did. Ms. Darlene and her son and granddaughter live in Northeast Portland still, and they have a huge family that's all connected to all kinds of stuff. So she's speaking here, so we'll show you Ms. Darlene talking.
Do what now? Oh. I mean, what's the city going to do with it? The same thing they're doing with everything else? Just let it sit there? I would like to see a lot of the families that moved out of the neighborhood come back. Because we had a nice neighborhood. You know, you didn't have to worry about people coming, breaking in your houses and all that stuff. Because when I first came here, during the summer, if it was really hot, I'd leave my front door open. My name is Geraldine Gaither, and I've been in Portland since 1965. My parents and my brothers and sisters were living here. I came to Portland because I was mom and dad sick, so I had to come. My parents were living on Kirby, right across from Boyce Elliott School. And so that's where we lived until 2012. We had a lot of relatives that lived up by Emmanuel, and they had no choice. They had to, take whatever they were given for their homes and move out, because Emmanuel was buying up everything. And it wasn't nice, but I was hoping they wouldn't, want to buy our side of the street. They were talking about it, but that my dad said he wasn't going to give his up. We had a lot of relatives that had to, move out because the state wanted their homes. And it wasn't good. It was a nice neighborhood. Everybody knew each other. Everybody knew each other's kids. There were a couple of little neighborhood stores down on Mississippi, and the owners of the stores knew all of our kids. Mr. Phillips, that owned the drugstore, he could tell you who belonged to who, and all you had to do, if you needed something, write a note, If the kid was big enough to go to the store, I called Mr. Phillips and I said, Mr. Phillips, I'm sending Archie down, with a note, and he's got the money. He would give Archie my stuff, give him his change, and he called and tell me Archie's coming on his way back. That's just the way the neighborhood was. And the street that I lived on Beach, right between Kirby and Borthwick, and it was 3 of us on that corner that had kids. And people called us the 3 bitches, because we didn't bother anybody, but we wouldn't let anybody come in there and bother us either. As we just looked after each other. It was like one big family. If one had something and the other one needed it, they got it. Regardless of what it was, help pay a utility bill or help pay the rent or whatever. We helped each other out. So, you got to stay connected to your family because family is all you really got. People that live in that neighborhood now, they could see you getting murdered in the middle of the street and wouldn't call 911. Because we went through that before we moved out of there, They just moved in and took over. The same people that didn't want to live over there with us back in the 60s and 70s. So, but I loved living over there.
So Ms. Darlene's son Archie that she mentioned is the little boy in that last video footage. That's footage of her family at their house. And so this is, one of the things that we've been trying to do with oral histories is to kind of revise the history of the community that was there. The space that she's talking about was the pretty much exclusive home for Black folks. It was redlined until the 1990s. There was a large expose done in the mid-1990s about predatory lending and redlining by mainstream banks in these neighborhoods. And so the city took another urban renewal action at that time. And that was sort of kicked off the period that she's talking about with people moving in, people who didn't want to live with us before who are now there. And of course, Portland is a hot city. Hip place to move, and Northeast Portland has been the space that many people have moved. So neighborhoods that used to be majority Black, there's now no neighborhood that's more than 50% Black, and the only neighborhoods that are close to that are ones that have significant public housing developments in them. Most of these neighborhoods are now about 20% Black and 80% white. So trying to bring this voice a person who still lives in Northeast Portland. She lives maybe just a mile up the road from where she was talking about there, but is talking both about history, but is also very present, right? Not to be invisibilized in this space as only historical, but to bring this voice here and project this kind of the shadow archive or this marginalized person's archive into a physical space where there have been demolitions, to look at Black family photos, to look at stories of elders right in a space that was raised as a Black neighborhood in order to build this infrastructure.
So now we're gonna jump in this project that's, is in Northwest Portland, had these spots in the public realm. It ended at the community college in Northeast Portland with a group show of about 50 artists Black artists of various Black geographies. So this is one of the installations that was in that gallery. It's set up as a living room with a TV guide on the table and a remote so that you can flip through these different videos. And on the wall, that collage of photos is the family portraits of all of the videographers that contributed material. And then also hanging on the wall are these passport covers that I sew by hand. So this collective, You Read Press, it stands for United Republic of the African Diaspora, and Republic has a colon on it, like as in addressing the public. So the idea is that you can take this passport cover from these different fabrics that I've sourced from Brazil or from Harlem or wherever, and you can slide your passport in it and be from the diaspora rather than any given country. There's a Frantz Fanon quote in there as well. But so these videos, I put out a global call and got about like 80 videos from people and selected 20. And so I offer free transcription and subtitling for previously monolingual work. So the idea is that Black feminists from the Netherlands, from Brazil, people from Haiti, from the Dominican Republic, we can share material with each other, kind of creating this intra-diasporic dialogue. And I really wanted to set up the living room in a way that's kind of like the ideal place, this ideal spot to sit in this gentrifying neighborhood that kind of unifies these different, I don't know, just kind of the tact and care that your auntie has when she sets up in her living room, you know? So I just want it to be really beautiful and just colorful and a place where you could sit and see these representations. So yeah, I can switch that. So this is some more work that was in the gallery. On the left here, this is a piece by Joseph Coulier. It's from his Black Abstraction series. And it says, "I woke up early this morning to bring a slow genocide to a screeching halt." And so he hangs these silk posters in galleries, but he also wheat pastes them in the street in contested areas to kind of remind people, I guess just of his own, like, his way of sourcing imagery. So this abstraction, he gets photos from archives and he abstracts them to almost, you can't even see them anymore, and puts these different kind of socially engaged poetics out into the public realm. And this other image, this is called data crop sculpture. So data crop sculpture, I'll just read what Ariel Jackson says about this piece. "In attempts to reveal what might have factored into what caused my family to lose their farmland during the 1980s and 1990s, she's from New Orleans, I highlighted notes from Pete Daniels' Dispossession, Discrimination Against African American Farmers in the Age of Civil Rights. Using my 1970s typewriter, I printed each highlighted note onto muslin and sewed them onto fabric found and collected from my grandmother. Toward the top of each dowel, the leaves are pink and yellow, reflecting the colors my grandmother wore in the garden or field, while the bottom leaves are black, brown, and blue, reflecting the colors my grandfather wore while working in the field." So all of the pieces in the gallery were all of these artists thinking kind of at these intersections of place and race and yeah, just all kinds of things. I'll show another piece here. So this is Christopher Paul Jordan. So we saw New York, we saw New Orleans, and then this is an artist from Tacoma, Washington. And the newspaper there wrote a really nice piece. "Equal parts historian and visionary, Jordan uses the overlapping histories of land use, urban planning, and displacement in Tacoma as a microcosm to address the whole history of Black migration across the United States." This is what he saw every day from his bedroom window growing up in Tacoma, Washington. It's a junkyard. And so this series, so this thing that you see here, these are Google glasses, Google Cardboard. So when you look inside of them, you see these 3D images. And he also had it in the public realm as well. So you, rather than seeing out far as a magnifying glass, you would look through this and actually see these juxtapositions of the places that he grew up. And the way that he describes the series documents a salvage yard across the alley from my childhood home. As my neighborhood faces approximately $10 billion in planned development over the next 5 years, the Jones Yard, one of the longest running Black-owned businesses in the district, is more and more like an unofficial archive of the fragmented dwellings from my past neighbors. So he would look out his window and just see all of the things that they would leave behind. He also juxtaposed that with this piece So that one's called 1, and then these images are called 0. This series examines the history of Black migration across the US in a ritual context, referencing the Yoruba ceremony of entreating the 4 or 6 sacred directions. The images explore ritual as a form of timeline triangulation, dealing in tandem with the cardinal extremities of the continent and the city of Tacoma to locate where we have been, where we are, and where we are going in the construction of our belonging in the diaspora. And so this particular, each image is paired with the direction. So this one's west. It says sending for themselves, manifesting abundance. So that image goes with this one. So she's pointing west. So you have the juxtaposition of the first image that I showed of the junkyard, that unofficial archive of the neighborhood, and then you have this other image on top of this Yoruba ritual. And so there were several of them. This is another example. It says, and during their communion, they were lifted by a spark inside, and the street lights would never speak again. And then on the white image below, the directional part, it says, and they gathered all of the traveling shoes of their children, and they sewed with those who had none. They got down. So this is for the direction for down. We also had different artists. We had dancers as well in the gallery. And so we really wanted to bring as many people at that last stop of this is the Black Spatial Imaginary project, to kind of incubate ideas, not just through reading groups that we held, but also through movement and performance art and celebration. And so these 3 dancers, you know, they come from a different discipline than me. They come from a different discipline than Lisa, but we're really interested in what through improvisation and through just like, not just coming from different fields, what we can pull out of each other, but what we as Black people can pull out of each other, you know, in these spaces, just holding space together and getting to share this art. What can the art pull out of us, but what can we pull out of each other? I think especially just in even marshaling resources towards doing that. What does that mean? Even just getting the grant money to be in the gallery together in this contested gentrifying neighborhood. So that's all I'll say there.
Yeah, and I think it's been very important to our work that we try to be very deeply grounded in the particulars of Portland, but also recognizing that these are not unique stories. We want to be deeply connected not only to other cities in the United States, but globally to the ways that we can think about how we are all talking about space and place and home and pulling these pieces out of one another. So one of the things that happened during sort of late in the course of this project and is still very live right now and continues to be part of our work and sort of activism and creation of material objects is that this site right here, the Hill Block building, which is referred to when Mr. Oline says an Emmanuel Hospital came and bought it all. This was one of the key sites that was condemned and purchased with eminent domain by the City of Portland's Portland Development Commission, which now goes by Prosper Portland. That fixes everything. And we still use the term urban renewal in Portland. So this is part of a current live urban renewal district now. It's a TIF district, a tax increment financing district, but we still use urban renewal. So it's part of a current live urban renewal district. And it was the heart of the Black business community. This was sort of was a drugstore, but then there was also a number of some few hundred apartments and other homes that were owned on the site. They were cleared. We found it really important that we found this color photo of this because oftentimes in Portland you see this photo on black and white, and that sort of gives the imagination that this was happening during the first wave of urban renewal, right, in the 50s. This was in the 70s that this happened, right, that this was torn down. If you've been to Portland, that onion dome that's there is the roof of a gazebo in a park that's nearby in the neighborhood. And its presence is, it's pretty fraught for people in the community who, I think in some ways it was intended to be a memorial. That's can be offensive if you don't want to be memorialized, you want to be alive. But it also is sort of like the trophy hunter. You know, we've captured your space and we've kind of put this trophy here. So anyway, this site, our new mayor, which we are writing to, dear next mayor, is in a very active negotiation directing Prosper Portland to try to get this site back from what is now Legacy Health they've never built on the site. It is a vacant lot. Part of it is a parking lot, but it's never been developed. So there is this live conversation to try to bring this back into development. We've been working with Portland African American Leadership Forum and others to, first of all, to just simply educate more broadly folks about the history of this site. It's been a site of contestation in the Black community for a long time, but in the very beginning of that video with Ms. Geraldine, she said, what are they going to do with it? And this is the site she was talking about when she's like, they're just going to do the same thing they always do. Many people don't even know about it. So we've been using some of the tools that Shrita mentioned about DIY publishing to create sort of a tabloid style newspaper. And we'll be doing that throughout this year to follow along the process. Unfortunately, the first public meeting to ask the community what they want to be on that site was supposed to be earlier this week, but it snowed for 10 minutes in Portland, so everything was canceled. So can't report, but there's a lot of, for those who know about it, there's a very intense desire to engage, but many people don't know. And so that's one of the reasons we chose the newspaper form. On the left is some images from the first edition of the paper on the background of the site. Many people don't know that it's a live development issue. Paul also really wants to push this beyond just this site and the idea of having a community land trust or other community-based ownership for this site. But it's a very immediate opportunity to have housing, to have art and cultural spaces, to have Black organizations, et cetera. That's very tangible, but it's also seen as sort of the thin end of the wedge into a larger discussion about redevelopment in Portland, which continues to be in its largest sort of opportunity sites right now for redevelopment are places that Black people used to live. Along the Broadway corridor, the idea of redesigning and redeveloping the entire Coliseum area now, and to deal with some of the freeway construction and sort of make that area vital. And then also near the train station on the west side in downtown Portland, the original home where Black folks lived pre-World War II, when they were connected with the Pullman porters, et cetera, also has a very large, so multi-billions of dollars of development are expected, and to try to lay down some principles around a different imagination of what that could look like and how that could speak to Black histories, but also Black presence on the site. And also, maybe get some wealth generation going for the community, right? So we're working with this kind of very immediate politics, and this came up toward the end of the site. There is also, in Portland, a very active turn in the urban renewal district that covers Northeast Portland, because of the advocacy of Paul and because of the sort of relentlessness of folks in the community to create a housing strategy that focuses on the return of displaced people who have intergenerational ties to the neighborhood, who either already have been displaced, or to stabilize folks who live in the neighborhood who need affordable housing because prices there are really skyrocketing. PCRI, Portland Community Reinvestments Initiative, is the only Black-led CDC in Portland. They are building a multifamily building now at the corner of MLK and Rosa Parks. I mean, just tremendously symbolic. It will house 70 families in family-sized units who have historic ties to the neighborhood through the use of this sort of right-to-return policy. And so it's become, they're very dedicated to the idea of what they call Pathway 1000, that when the current day urban renewal district was instigated, there was a promise of 1,000 housing units, zero displacement, 1,000 new housing units would be built. And they are trying to revive that as a failed promise. And this is part of their plan and project. And to sort of continue to recognize this as kind of like the beating heart of the Black community. So this will be King and Parks Apartments. It's at MLK and Rosa Parks. And Sure to Town will be doing some public art for that space.
Well, you're doing it too, so.
I'm pulling out some maps. I found some maps.
I just want to show you a quick clip of what I showed the folks at PCRI when we first talked about what the public art could be at this building.
She had just, told us we're going to move to Oregon. We were excited because all we knew was Casa Grande, and we were excited to go somewhere different. I remember the first time I seen all of the evergreen trees, me and Darlene looked at each other and said, "This is like the Garden of Eden." And she said, "Look at all the Christmas trees. We won't ever have to buy another Christmas tree. We can just go out and steal them. Forgive us, Lord."
There we go again with that trademark.
So that's my aunt's voice. Every summer on what would be my grandmother's 88th birthday. Actually, I'm going to pause this for a second. I record my family. I just ask different questions, do different, just try to understand the trajectory from Arkansas to Arizona, clearing cotton fields, and then seasonally picking berries in Oregon, and then deciding to move to Oregon because it seemed like a nice place. I guess that says a lot about Arizona, like how hostile Arizona is. And so this was just one of the stories. And so what I wanted to do was really like
Forgive us, Lord.
think of these stories that her cackle's really good. Think of these stories that we all have inside of us, like that our elders have. And so having this gold line start on the inside of the building and then kind of come outside of the building as well, and really just to honor everyone that will live in that building's path to Portland, right? Because in studies of the Great Migration, like the Pacific Northwest is often left out of that narrative. And so and whether, you just got to Portland, but your grandma lived there, or whether you have been there since the 40s or 50s, I just really want to create this kind of work that honors that movement westward. I don't know how to use SketchUp Pro, so this is very preliminary. Don't make fun of me at all, okay? This is it was very hard to even get to the point where you can see these pathways from, I guess what's the West South Central Division census tract, because that's where a lot of Black people came to Oregon from, was Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, from that cluster, because a lot of folks that were deeper in the South, they went more East Coast, right? So yeah, that's the actual Greyhound line from the county where my grandmother was born, Blytheville, Mississippi County, Arkansas, upward to where Portland would be there. So it's a work in progress. We're out here doing it.
So just to close with, so this is an image just showing that's the path of, this is a Black Spatial Imaginary. But one of our other sort of guide stones has been Kevin Young's work speaking about the shadow book. In other words, the books that we lose through the Black written books that we lose, whether they've been redacted or unwritten or lost to time, and how we can reclaim those and sort of re-excavate those. But in particular, in thinking about what it means to save the imagination, that the imagination is not a distraction, it's not escapism, but that imagination is how we got here as Black people. The Black imagination conducts its escape by way of the underground railroads of meaning, a practice we could call the Black art of escape. So that's what we're trying to do. We're working hard on it with this larger collaboration in terms of art, urban planning, Black geographies, and all the stuff.
That's it.
That's it.